Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl, an adult services librarian at the Westland Public Library. As part of the library's online programming series While We're Closed, we are pleased to welcome William Sullivan. He has written 21 books about the Northwest, including Hiking Oregon's History, Oregon Favorites, and the Case of D.B. Cooper's Parachute. His journal of a 1,000-mile hike he took across Oregon, listening for Coyote, was chosen by the Oregon Cultural Heritage Commission as one of Oregon's 100 books, the most significant books in the state's history. In this presentation, he will be talking about new hikes in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington in conjunction with the release of a new edition of his book, which is available for purchase online through Powell's and Amazon. Just a quick note that we are recording this in April 2020, when many trails and recreation areas are closed. If you're planning to go for a hike, be sure to check on closures as well as the latest health and safety guidelines. Okay, I'll let you take it away.
So it's my pleasure to be here, especially because I had planned to give a talk in person, not only at the Westland Public Library, but at a dozen other places around Portland and hiking clubs and bookstores. And I can't do that in person because of this pandemic. But I do want to be able to tell you about all these interesting new trails. And it's particularly important now because people need to spread out a little bit. And that means not going to the same crowded place. So that's my whole point here today. I want to show you some interesting new places that you can go that are not crowded and haven't been affected by fires and other problems. Some new hikes in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington. So every year I update my local hiking guide for the Portland, Vancouver area, but this year I had to do a complete renovation of it because of fires and changes and the need to spread out a bit. I thought I'd start out my program here though by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm probably best known as the guy who hiked 1,000 miles across Oregon. And Cheryl mentioned this journal of this 1,000-mile hike. I wanted to visit all the wilderness areas in Oregon and naively thought that easy way to do this would be to walk through them all at once. So I set out from the westernmost point of Oregon alone with a backpack and in 2 months walked to the easternmost point at the bottom of Hell's Canyon and along the way kept this journal of my adventures. And down here is where I was held at gunpoint by marijuana growers. And up here, I poisoned myself with mushrooms, another great idea when you're alone in the woods, and wound up hiking 40 miles a day through Hell's Canyon, trying to outrun these October snowstorms. To this day, it amazes me that people read this book and it makes them want to go hiking. But it's kind of become a classic. And the other adventure memoir I've written that's also available as an audiobook and on Kindle is Cabin Fever, the story of this log cabin that my wife and I built by hand out in the wilds of Oregon's Coast Range. There is no road or electricity. To this day, you have to hike in 1.5 miles to get to this cabin. We built it using only hand tools to prove you could do it the pioneer way. And because we were broke, so just a crosscut saw and an axe. The whole house cost only $400. We still live there in the summer and still have to hike in. And I have a typewriter. I've written all of my novels out there at this great place to get away from pandemics and internet and anything else. And so one of the novels, I've been doing this series of murder mysteries with an Oregon angle. The first one is about the missing Einstein formula for quantum gravity. This was inspired by my son, who is an astrophysicist, and said I should write about this lost formula for quantum gravity. That part is true. Einstein threw away this formula. It could be anywhere. So I have it turn up in an attic in Oregon. Why not? And it causes no end of mischief. Some of the characters in that were so popular, I brought them back to deal with D.B. Cooper. Now, this is the great unsolved mystery of the Northwest. What happened to this guy who parachuted with $250,000 and got away with it? It's the only unsolved hijacking in the history of the FBI. But if he's alive, he'd be in his 70s. And so I have him living in Portland in plain sight in this novel. And he's writing his memoir, and it's all completely true until he jumps out of the plane with the money. And then he admits he's got a problem. Someone's figured out who he is. They're blackmailing him. people start dying. My Portland detective and his autistic daughter have to unravel the whole mess, which winds up involving the Russian mafia and voodoo donuts. And then the same detective is brought back to deal with the Rajneeshis. Now, I don't know if you were in Oregon in the 1980s, but when this guru from India brought 3,000 people, he built a city in the eastern Oregon desert, got into all kinds of trouble. The Bhagwan himself has been dead for 27 years, but he always said he'd be reincarnated. And so in my novel, they now claim that he is. They say that he's actually a 26-year-old barista in a Portland coffee shop. And so again, they build a new commune, people start dying. My detective and his autistic daughter have to unravel that mess as well. So had some fun with these murder mysteries. And then historical novels. My wife is Danish background, so we speak the language and done a series of historical novels about the Viking Age, not hiking, but Vikings. The first one about the start of the Viking Age in Norway, and the new one about the middle of the Viking Age in Denmark. And each of these is based on the actual excavation of a real Viking ship. And the latest one deals with Harold Bluetooth, who it turns out is not merely a wireless technology. He was the Viking king of Denmark who conquered England because the English king had murdered his daughter. And now I am a fifth generation Oregonian, so my interest in Oregon history is deep as well. And the book on the left is The Human History of Oregon, wagon train routes and gold mining ghost towns and how to find all these places. And the one at the right is scarier. That's the natural history of Oregon: floods, fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, and the eruption of Mount St. Helens and the big tsunami they're predicting for the coast. So people die on every page. That's a great book to take to the beach. Well, then I've done a couple of guidebooks that cover the whole state. On the left is the Wilderness Guide to the Backwoods. So that's got detailed maps of every wilderness and more for adventurers. And the one on the right, that's what my kids call the Wussy Hiking Guide. It's a little unfair because I just picked the most beautiful trails and also hot springs and bed and breakfasts. It's sort of a travel guide with a hiking problem. And then this one is month by month. And every month of the year, I recommend half a dozen appropriate things to do in that season. But now I want to talk about the local hikes around the Portland, Vancouver area that I'm going to try to show you ones that are not crowded that you don't know about. And there's some brand new trails. And this is part of this new edition that just came out here this April with expanded and all of that. And, you know, you can start right in Portland if you're looking for new things with some bridges. And one of them is the Walker Footbridge across Burnside that takes the most dangerous part of the 30-mile Wildwood Trail and makes it into one of the most interesting parts. Now, this bridge was designed by Portland artist Ed Carpenter to sort of resemble a path through sword ferns. And it makes a nice 5-mile loop destination from the Oregon Zoo. Another bridge, of course, Tillicum Crossing, which the shape of which was designed to match the shape of Mount Hood. And now it's the biggest bridge in the country that's open to hikers, but not cars, and makes possible a lovely 4-mile loop over to the Steel Bridge. But you want to get out of town, right? You want to get out of town, you want to go to the gorge, and there was a big fire there. In 2017, the Eagle Creek fire burned up most of the Oregon side of the gorge. Trails have been reopening, most are reopened, but they look a little different sometimes, and they're still crowded. You can hardly find a spot to park near Multnomah Falls. So let's not go there right away. Let's look for something new that's going to be uncrowded and is no farther away. Cross the Columbia River to the Steigerwald Lake Refuge. This is in Washougal, so it's right across the river from Troutdale or Portland. And this is a wildlife refuge where Lewis and Clark camped in April of 1806. And there were so many birds they could hardly sleep. It was so noisy at night. But in the meantime, it was diked and drained and was converted to a lot of dairies and sawmills. And but then part of it has been reopened as this wildlife refuge. But they're thinking maybe it would be better if we remove those dikes and gave more room for the birds and fish and things. And so that's what they're doing. And the access, the usual parking spot, is closed now as they do that renovation, but you can get there a different way. And what they're planning to do here this coming summer is to remove 1/2 mile of dike and move 1 million cubic feet of dirt, or to build a new dike that does not that lets the river flood into the wildlife refuge. They're going to have to raise Highway 14 by 10 feet in order to do that. In the meantime, this year you can start at Captain William Clark Park, named, of course, for Lewis and Clark, and walk along the dike over to see what's going on. And you can still hike the trails, in most of the trails in the wildlife refuge, but you might start over here instead this year, or you could start 1 mile further back at a very interesting steamboat landing. And so if you're walking along the dike at the start, this part dogs are allowed. In the wildlife refuge, they're not. When you get to the wildlife refuge, you'll see this fish ladder they're going to be taking out in the next year. It was really the reason that they decided to do this whole renovation in the area, because the fish ladder was not letting fish very well in through this dike. So they decided, rather than replace this fish ladder, just tear out the whole dike. And the trail in the refuge includes bridges and boardwalks that go across wetlands where you are sure to see birds, maybe not as many as Lewis and Clark, but you're certain to see these great blue herons that sit there looking for frogs to fish out. And you will see western pond turtles. These are rare most places in Western Oregon, but they are always sunning out on the logs in this refuge. If you start at William Clark Park, this is a busy place in summer. That's Cottonwood Beach, and it is one of the popular spots to go swimming. But if you start back 1 mile earlier, then you're at the steamboat landing. And this is an interesting dock now, but historically, this was the site of the dock for the Pendleton Woolen Mills there in Washougal. So an interesting way to start to hike on a new trail that they're working on. You can go see what's happening this summer, and next year they'll have a whole new trailhead back on Highway 14. Now let's go up to Mount St. Helens. And a lot has been changing here. Just the mountain itself keeps changing. The lava domes have stopped growing. The last one stopped growing in 2007, that were filling the crater there. But at the rate they are growing, they have been growing since the eruption in 1980 that blew off the top of the mountain. They will replace the entire mountain in 2,000 years. And that's actually about right, because everything above timberline was less than 2,000 years old anyway. This mountain blows up and restores itself all the time. What's happening in the crater, you can see that the glacier has formed around the lava dome and is growing and has merged around the bottom of it. And this is puzzling, because there isn't, every other glacier in Oregon is retreating and in Washington, but this one is growing, and it's thought it's because of rockfall off of the rim that's adding bulk to the glacier. Well, the new hike I want to do, you can go look up at the visitor center, take a look at this, but a new hike I want you to take is on the side that did not get blasted, toward Portland. And it goes along the Columbia River to a lake that disappeared a few years ago. And they'll have to explain that. That's why this trail I consider new, even though it's not actually a brand new trail, but it's kind of different now since 2004. And it starts just outside the National Monument in the National Forest at a horse camp. And that throws a lot of people off. So there aren't really many horses there, and there aren't many hikers either. It's a pretty quiet spot. Hike up the river for 1 mile and you get to these huge ash cliffs. And then a couple more miles, you get to what used to be a lake, McBride Lake. It's still called McBride Lake on most maps, but it isn't a lake since an ash flow in 2004 filled that whole area, and a forest is starting to grow there now. Interesting place to go. If you go another 1.5 miles, you get a great view across a lava flow up to Mount St. Helens. If you're on a horse, you can come back on a loop on this 7-mile extra thing that it does involve some old logging roads. All right, so here we are starting at the Kalama Horse Camp, where they have a shelter and there's lots of facilities, but and then you head out along this mountain stream that doesn't really look like it's going to be in a very violent area, but you'll get clues about this later. You may pass a few equestrians. There are not a lot there, and it's actually a great place if you have a horse that's near Portland area. In the fall, there are not only huckleberries, but also a lot of mushrooms, and you want to watch these. This one right here is an amanita, and these are deadly poisonous. There are lots of kinds of these, but it's the most common source of poisonings in Oregon, the panther, or this one, the fly amanita. And the trail is on this ash, but beside it you can see the whole forest floor is carpeted with moss. And that's actually a thin layer of moss over hundreds of feet of ash. And you can tell that when you get to these ash cliffs where the river has carved out this huge bowl. You can see that you're really walking on several hundred feet of forest is growing on top of. When you get to McBride Flat, this used to be the lake, but what caused this ash flow in 2004? That was long after the mountain blew up. It was actually the melting of the glaciers. After the mountain was decapitated in 1980, it left some fragments of glaciers up there that are on this side, the sunny south side, are melting. And as they melt, they launch debris flows that go down the valleys. If you want to see where that flow came from, there's another hike that's changed a lot right in that area. And that takes you to Blue Lake and Sheep Canyon. And there you can see the source of that ash flow. The trailhead has moved. It used to be 4 miles further down the road, but this ash flow wiped out the road. And so you start back here at Blue Lake. Blue Lake was created by one of these ash flows as well. After 3 miles, and you're not in the blast zone, so these are nice big trees, you get to Sheep Canyon where there's a waterfall and a little campsite, possible turnaround point, but if you can go another 1.8 miles, you get to the South Fork Toutle River, this gigantic canyon that's spectacular. And then if you want to do a loop, this is steep uphill in the sun, but you get into the blast zone and you see a bunch of flowers, and it does make a nice loop if you've got the energy. So here we are at the trailhead. This was where the road was wiped out by the ash flow in 2004. The trail looks kind of different for the first half mile too. And then you get to Blue Lake, which was backed up by some of these mud flows. And I think they've misnamed it Blue Lake because it's really green. Anyway, the forest involves these big noble firs, and it's rare to see them that big. It's in the part of the mountain that was not affected by the 1980 blast directly. Here's Sheep Canyon. There's a big waterfall just downstream and a little campsite up. But if you can go on further, go over to another 1.5 miles to the South Fork Toutle River. And here the 1980 blast really just reamed out this canyon and left this amazing debris cliffs. And the Toutle Trail, which goes all the way around, the Lewitt Trail rather, which goes all the way around Mount St. Helens, has to cross the Toutle River here. And it does it with ropes. So you lower yourself down on ropes that are left there, and then you have to cross this raging river with no bridge. It's a good place to turn back because on the other side, there's a rope that goes straight up that cliff, and it's got like boulders hanging loose and everything. If you're going around the mountain, you would do this. But if you're out for a day hike, this is a good place to turn around. And if you want to do this loop on the way back, you climb up into the blast zone and get nice views of the mountain and all of that. But also flowers. There's a lot of flowers that have come back in this area. This is one place you can see these bluebells. They're otherwise pretty uncommon, but they're beautiful there. And dwarf lupin, they're at the head of the washout that destroyed McBride Lake, turned it into a flat, and changed these trails and made new interesting trails at Mount St. Helens. Now, between Mount St. Helens and the Columbia Gorge is the Trapper Creek Wilderness. And here, there aren't exactly new trails, but there's kind of an overlooked one I want to point out because especially there's kind of a secret way in. The Trapper Creek Wilderness really became popular in the 1800s because of soda springs in that area. And travelers would come there to take the waters. And a big 3-story spa hotel was built there. It burned to the ground in 1934, but the Forest Service built a guard station in 1937 there. And there's still some like dispersed camping and private campgrounds, but the actual trailhead for the area is off to the side. This is plenty of parking and all of that. If you're hiking up the creek, then you don't actually see the Trapper Creek for the first 1.5 miles. And then I suggest that you go over to cross the creek and visit this grove of giants. Now there's almost no elevation gain on this 2-mile hike in. So it's a great hike for kids and you see these giant trees. Beyond that, there are more distant destinations. You could go to the top of Observation Peak, but you're looking at another 5 or 7 miles uphill. That's a long day's hike. The other thing would be to go up to Soda Peaks Lake, but that's 3 miles steep uphill. You're gaining 2,500 feet of elevation. Well, there's an easier way, and that would be to sneak in the back way. There is a paved road that goes to a hidden trailhead up near Soda Peaks Lake. It's not the best paved road, but it is almost entirely paved. And then it's only 2.5 miles and not too steep into Soda Peaks Lake. So let's look at these trips now. If you start at the Government Springs area, you could rent this cabin, the 1937 guard station. It's $65 a night, but wow, it's booked in advance a long ways, especially on weekends. And then when you start at the regular trailhead, you enter the wilderness and cross and go through these big forests and cross Trapper Creek. And then I suggest that you go up to this grove of giants, 14-foot diameter trees. They're gigantic red cedar trees. And just beyond this, though, the trail suddenly launches uphill like a rocket. And that's where you might want to turn back and instead sneak around to the other trailhead. And it's where the pavement ends, and there's really no sign there at all. There's my wife standing by the trailhead, but you look at it and you say, I don't think that's really a trail. And that's part of the charm of this, that have it just a little bit hidden, that's okay. Just beyond those bushes, like 50 feet, there is the trailhead. And then is a perfectly good trail that takes you up over a pass with views of the mountains and then down to Soda Peaks Lake with a place to take kids for a first backpack. And when you're up at that view out to Mount Adams, well, maybe we should go there. It's kind of the overlooked mountain of the Cascades, because you kind of have to drive past other mountains on the way there. If you're coming from Portland, you drive past Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens. If you're coming from Seattle, you have to drive past Mount Rainier. Why not stop there instead? And so it's kind of been overlooked. And the reason I'm calling this hike Mount Adams' Other Meadows is because the most famous meadow is closed. That's Bird Creek Meadows. It's on the Yakima Indian Reservation, and the Yakima Nation has had some troubles with this access to that Bird Creek Meadows, this beautiful meadow on the side of the southeast corner of Mount Adams. It's on their reservation, and they let other people go there, but they had 3 fires in the last 15 years on that road. They just closed it, and they may let hikers in on the Round a Mountain Trail to get there, starting at the South Climb Trailhead, but that's a long ways, and I'm thinking they probably won't really. So the Bird Creek Meadows, not really a destination anymore. If you start at the South Climb Trailhead on the south side of the mountain there, it's a busy place. There are a lot of people that are climbing the mountain from there. You do have to get permits for that. Anything above 7,000 feet, you have to get a a permit for. And the Round the Mountain Trail, I should stress, does not go around the mountain. The east half of the mountain is on the Indian reservation where you're not allowed, and there is no trail across Hell Roaring Canyon. So it's really sort of half around the mountain trail. And if you go the other way around on the Round the Mountain Trail from that trailhead, which is legal and open and doesn't require permits, you could go to Salt Creek, which is a nice destination too. But I'm going to recommend you go to the other side of Mount Adams, to the north side, northwest. And this is just a little bit farther from Portland, but on a pretty good road. It's quieter, has, I think, prettier meadows and easier access for hikers. So start at Toutle Lake, and that's a good car campground and place to take the kids for a summer weekend. And then there are a couple of trailheads that take you up to the high country. I'm going to recommend the Divide Camp trailhead. The more popular one is Killing Creek trailhead above it on the map there. But Divide Camp is only 2 miles up to the first meadows, and then less than a mile up to the Pacific Crest Trail. And if you turn left, you get to a ford of Adams Creek, which is kind of an iffy crossing place to turn back. If you go to the right on that, you cross the Lewis River, which sounds frightening, but is not, and can go on to visit there's a lot of exploring you can do in that area up there. So we're starting at Toutle Lake. Great place to take your kayak. There's a 1 mile trail around the lake. You're going to need reservations on weekends for a campsite, our campground there. Midweek, you could probably get a site. And then the Killing Creek trailhead is the busier one, but you have to have a permit for your car. You got to have a Northwest Forest Pass. And the trail is dusty and crowded, is popular with horses. So why not try Divide Camp? You don't need a permit for your car. The trail is not dusty, and it starts out through Lupin. And then it's really only 2 miles up to the first of these meadows. They just get better and better. When you get to the Pacific Crest Trail, if you turn left, after a 1/4 mile, you get to Adams Creek. And this is the outwash of the entire Adams Glacier. So it's a roaring thing. The Pacific Crest Trail crosses here on sticks like this. It is frightening, especially if you have a backpack. And so I'm thinking, here's a good place to take a look at this and turn around and go the other way and then you're just going, the Pacific Crest Trail goes through these lovely alpine meadows and reaches the Lewis River. Here is the Lewis River. This is the entire river at that point. So that one's easy to cross. And from there, there are just all this interesting alpine country with wildflowers and meadows. It's a place to look for wildlife as well. You're likely to see mountain goats, but also other animals. And if you look on that giant boulder to the right, you might see something. If we get in closer, it's a hoary marmot. This critter is up there whistling at you. It's defending its territory and frightening away intruders. But you're likely to see marmots if you're up there in the Mount Adams Meadows. And now we're going to go from the Adams Glacier and ice to fire in the Columbia Gorge and the effects that has had. A lot of the trails have been reopened. This is the Youth Conservation Corps crew that was doing some work there, but most of the trails have been reopened by the Trail Keepers of Oregon. This is a volunteer group of old guys mostly, and some old gals in the sort of not dead yet category, who defy logic and age by going out there and sawing through gigantic logs and rebuilding these trails. And they've done a tremendous job. Most of the trails really have been repaired. And it's kind of interesting to see how the effects of the fire, in many places you don't even notice the fire, like here at Multnomah Falls. And in other places, the fire has had a beneficial effect, like here at Angel's Rest. This is a very popular and crowded viewpoint hike, one of the closest in the Columbia Gorge. And it kind of shows the effects of the fire. The fires are often spotty. They have this mosaic where they leave patches of green forest and often burn through the underbrush. But fires do burn uphill. They like to burn uphill. So, and they don't like moisture. So the trails along creeks and waterfalls are still mostly green. And whereas the crests of the ridges, the fires plume out there and toast them. And this is why Angel's Rest had a view in the first place, that other fires have gone through and plumed out there and burnt off the trees. Brush and trees were starting to grow back. The fire has cleaned it out again. And um, the hike up to Angel's Rest is just a parade of people. So if you go past it, then you, toward Joaquina Falls, you quickly leave the crowds behind. And this really is, it's a pleasure to do that, to get out and to see what the forest is doing. And the forest has regrown in a lot of ways. And of course, one of the first pioneer flowers to come is fireweed, but you'll also see a lot of tiger lily. This has just loved the fire. The whole ground cover has come back. So the Columbia Gorge is green again. And actually most of the trees are still green too. Along the wetter areas of the trail, you'll see bleeding hearts here and huge areas covered by candy flower. This is a montia. It's a wildflower that is edible, and both the flower and the leaves, but do not confuse it with stinky bob. This is an invasive geranium that likes disturbed areas, and so is actually the dominant ground cover near a lot of the Interstate 84 freeway and the first few hundred yards of the trails. But further inland, it peters out, gives way to native plants. Well, some of the trails are still not open. You can stop at Horsetail Falls and hike a mile up to Ponytail Falls. This is the one where the trail actually goes behind that fall. But beyond that it's going to be maybe another year before the rest of that trail is open. And at the trailhead there, Oneonta Gorge is still closed. That was a slot that you would hike through, and also this old highway tunnel, which they had carefully restored and reopened, but then the fire came through and burned the timbers, and so that may never reopen. And the gorge next to it, that slot canyon, of course it didn't burn, but they've left it closed because of liability issues for one thing, and there were just too many people up there, and also endangered plants. There are a number of endemic plants that grow only in that gorge, and so maybe it's okay to keep some places a little bit off limits. And then the Eagle Creek Trail itself. Now, they finished the restoration of this trail last fall, put in 8 bridges with helicopters, and the Trail Keepers of Oregon cleared out these very difficult, scary trails that are just ledges going in there. But they haven't reopened it yet this spring because of the virus. And I'm not exactly sure when it will be reopened, but when it does, it's going to be a zoo. It's going to be jammed with people and going up to see Punch Bowl Falls. And this, it's a very beautiful trail, but it makes you think maybe you shouldn't do that one. You know, when they have signs that saying, you know, don't park except in the parked areas and marked areas, and they are full and it's just too crowded. Why not go to a different Punch Bowl Falls? There is one. This one is near Hood River, on Hood River, where the two forks of Hood River come together. And it's a new trail in a new park. Has the same name, spelled slightly different, but brand new trails that just opened last summer. And so maybe try this Punch Bowl Falls instead of the one on Eagle Creek, which may be closed and is certainly going to be crowded when it's opened. So this one is just a few miles south of Hood River, where the two forks of the river come together. And the trail system is altogether less than 2 miles, goes down to the confluence of the creek and then up to a viewpoint, and you can make a loop by coming back on the Dogwood Trail. The whole area was targeted as a good site for a park 100 years ago, but it was only a couple of years ago that the Western Rivers Conservancy helped Wood River County acquire 102 acres. And then just last summer in 2019, the Trail Keepers of Oregon built the trail system in there. Look at the mileages. You're not going very far anywhere in this. So this is kind of a half-day hike, but I've got something for the other half of that day for you. Right away, within a few hundred feet, you get to this cliff. Hang on to kids and dogs here, looking right down to the east fork, west fork of the Hood River. On the far shore, there's this scary staircase coming down there that's off limits to the public, but is open to the Warm Springs Indian Reservation. The tribe uses this area for, they have rights to net salmon that leap up the falls. And above the falls, there's a viewpoint hanging right over a cliff, and you'd think, this is one place where you don't really need a sign saying no diving off of a 100-foot cliff, but apparently you do. Beyond that, you can see where the two branches of the river come together at this gravel beach down there. That's a popular destination. Even though the water is icy cold, this is glacier melt from Mount Hood. It's amazing on a hot day that people come down here and swim. It's pretty turbulent too, but a nice spot for a picnic. Then the trail goes up the other fork of the creek, and the trail keepers had some fun putting steps in out of these rounded boulders and left a gnome hidden under one of them. They're having a little too much fun with their trail building. At the far end, you get a view out there, and then you can make a loop back on the Dogwood Trail. So that's a nice half-a-day trip. What do you do with the other half? Well, nearby, there's a new trail in the little town of Mosier, which is not that far away, and it's right there on Interstate 84. You really do take the Mosier exit and park at Main Street in downtown Mosier for this trail, and then head up to a waterfall and up to a plateau and an overlook. But this is one of the great wildflower hikes of spring, and I like it because you don't have to deal with the permit crowds, the permit problem they have at Dog Mountain. On summer weekends there, you have to have get permits, and they're limited, and it costs money, and there are crowds. Whereas here, you don't have any of those problems. And you start out at a little totem pole park in downtown Mosier and cross the old Columbia River Highway bridge to the start of the trail that takes you up not only through wildflower fields, but through a little cemetery. And the cemetery has the tallest tombstone is the founder of the town of Mosier, Jonah Harrison Mosier, who was a cabinet maker. And he opened a stagecoach stop here in 1853. The town kind of didn't do great until the railroad came through in 1882, and that opened it up to the fruit boom. People realized you could grow fruit in this area almost anywhere and put it on the railroad and make money. Jonah Mosier built a turreted Victorian mansion in town, which you can see across the river from the trail. And then here he is in the cemetery. Beyond that, you pass Mosier Falls and enter the reserve that was founded by the Friends of the Columbia Gorge, donated by Nancy Russell, who founded the Friends of the Gorge and spearheaded the drive to save the gorge as a recreation area. And this trail is actually part of their Gorge Towns to Trails initiative, working with towns to provide recreation opportunities and opening it to the public, even though this is land that's privately owned by the Friends of the Columbia Gorge up there. This picture is taken in April, and you can see the balsam root are blooming out there, and they continue into June. This is our native sunflower, it just covers the hills, and also grass widows and other wildflowers. It's just a lovely hike. It's about a half-day trip again, you know, the whole thing, maybe 3-4 miles, but good with kids in it, and no permits, and really no crowds. It's surprising that this one is so not well known. And now I want to take you halfway to Mount Hood from Hood River or the Columbia Gorge, and that takes you to Lost Lake. And Lost Lake is not lost anymore. It was originally called Iiqualamatyam-isht in the Hood River tribe's native language, which meant heart of the mountains. And it was an 1880 expedition set out to try to find it. These white explorers went up there looking and wandered all around and could not find the lake, and finally declared that they weren't lost, the lake was. Anyway, now there's a campground with hundreds of sites and a lodge and all of that, and a fee booth at the entrance where they're going to ask you to pay $8 per car to get in. And you would need to pay that if you were going to do the 3-4 mile loop around the lake, which is very nice, or if you were going to hike up Lost Lake Butte for a view there. But you actually don't need to pay that fee if you drive through the area over to this hidden trailhead for the Huckleberry Mountain Trail. And this is the one I'm going to recommend, although I'm also going to recommend that you go ahead and pay the $8 fee, and I'll explain later why. Anyway, if you drive through the campground at the far end, then you get this trailhead, and it heads a mile up to a rock slide, another mile to the Pacific Crest Trail, a very quiet part of this trail. The only people on it really are Crest Trail hikers at that point. And then you can go over to a very nice rock slide viewpoint. And if you want, another 2 miles to an even better view at Buck Peak. So here we are at Lost Lake, and you can argue about whether you're going to talk your way past that fee booth with the $8 fee. Technically, you don't need it if you're going to go to this trailhead because, well, this is the parking area. That is the trailhead. It's really only visible when you're right there and you're looking at it. But that's one of the charms, I think, of this. The trail is going to be empty. You will not see people on this hike. What you'll see are bunchberry. Now, this is just carpets the ground out there. It looks like dogwood tree flowers, and actually it is very closely related to dogwood trees. It's just decided to grow on the ground as a little wildflower. And later in the summer, it develops a cluster of red berries, which is why it's known as bunchberry. The other interesting wildflower that you'll see on this hike and nowhere else in the world except Watum Lake is cutleaf bugbane. Now this grows waist high and has these big white plumes and all of that, but is an endemic, a wildflower that only grows at Lost Lake and Watum Lake and nowhere else in the world. It is popular with the pikas that live out there. This is one of the plants that these rock rabbits, rodents, gather all summer and store away in rock slides. And as you walk by the rock slides on this hike, you are likely to hear them whistling. They did survive the Eagle Creek fire, the pikas in the Columbia Gorge there, but they may not survive climate change. They do not do well with warm temperatures. A hot summer day can kill them. And this is really the biggest threat to the pikas. But anyway, you are likely to hear them whistling in alarm at you. And then up to the Pacific Crest Trail. And here you're hiking through just solid huckleberry bushes over to this, and along, on one side, all the way along, is the Bull Run watershed. This is Portland's water supply, and you're not allowed to enter that at all. It is not, but the Pacific Crest Trail is not the boundary of the watershed. It is the ridge line right next to the Pacific Crest Trail, which is often a few feet away. And so it is legal to go up to look at the Bull Run watershed up this rock slide here. Now, it isn't marked in other ways, but I call it the staircase rock slide because it looks like a kind of a staircase. And it's right there at a corner in the Pacific Crest Trail. And you go up 30 feet and boom, you're looking down into Bull Run Lake and Mount Hood and the whole of the Bull Run watershed, an area that is off limits to visitors, otherwise pretty much impossible to see or visit. But here you can take a good look at this, and it's a good place for a lunch. You're not only looking out to the lake, which I didn't know had an island in it, but up close to Mount Hood. And if you want a broader view, continue another 2 miles north along the Pacific Crest Trail to Buck Peak, which is the forested hill on the top back there. And from there, you get a panorama of Lost Lake there on the left, Mount Hood, and the whole route of your hike. It's a quiet way to visit Lost Lake and avoid the crowds. Now, why did I say that you might want to pay the $8 for your car? Well, that's because when you're done with this hike, it's really going to be tempting to go get a Sasquatch burger and an IPA at the Lost Lake Lodge. And they have a little takeout window there, and you can sit out at these picnic tables and see the lake and the mountains. It's a very nice way to end that hike, and you really only can do it if your car has the permit. So don't argue with the fee guy, just pay it, and then you can end your hike there. Well, now we're going to go up to Mount Hood. And some things have changed here, but it's, again, the geology that's changing things and crowds. One factor at Mount Hood is that the glaciers are melting here too. Mount Hood has lost more than half of its glacial ice in the last 100 years. And what's left, the ice is often cheesy. And so it collapses on summer days and launches mud flows that rip down the canyons and they tore out this temporary footbridge on the Elliott Branch 15 years ago and left a chasm there that closed the Timberline Trail for a decade. For 10 years, it was not legal or even really easy to cross this canyon there. But now the Forest Service has reopened that. The Timberline Trail is now a little bit longer because of this detour at the Elliott Branch. It's now exactly 40 miles around the mountain. And the 30 or 40, yeah, and there is no bridge. And that's what they've done at all the crossings around Mount Hood now, is instead of building these bridges, like here at Ramona Falls, they had a temporary footbridge across the Sandy River for every summer for years. But then a woman died at that crossing, and the Forest Service realized that they were liable if the bridge failed, but they're not liable if there's no bridge at all. And it's actually more dangerous to cross, but then you're on your own, and it's more of a wilderness experience. And so that's what's happened. And here on the very popular Ramona Falls Trail, the crossing is now at a place where the Sandy River is kind of undercutting a forest and toppling trees across the river. And so there almost always are logs that you can cross at your own risk. And that's the way that hiking the Timberline Trail now is a little bit wilder, a little more dangerous perhaps, but more authentic, I guess. In terms of bridges, if you want them, well, go to the new trail to Mirror Lake. The old trail had a terrible, dangerous parking area right there on the highway. And so the Forest Service moved it over to Ski Bowl and built a slightly longer but easier wide trail with 8 bridges along the way that take you up to Mirror Lake at a better grade. And there you have your reflection of Mount Hood. And you can continue up to Tom, Dick, and Harry Mountain, where you're looking down not only to Mirror Lake, but to Mount Hood. But that trail still is pretty heavily used. And so it winds up even getting muddy in spots. And even though it's 6 feet wide, you're passing people all the time, I'm going to recommend that instead you park at a dead-end road and hike to Zigzag Falls and some other trails that are right in that same area and a little bit overlooked. So here's the Mirror Lake Trail that starts at Government Camp, and the dotted area is the dotted red dots are the old trail that's been completely abandoned. And that's because that whole stretch of highway has fast traffic and now has a concrete barricade in the middle of it. So you're not going to cross that highway on foot, and that means that the old wagon chute at Laurel Hill is kind of cut off. But instead, start over here at the dead end of what used to be the original Mount Hood Loop Highway and hike a half a mile into Little Zigzag Falls. Charming, easy hike for kids. You can do it with a stroller. And from there, go visit an old highway tunnel and then do a loop up to Enid Lake, which takes you to Government Camp 2. This area is also interesting historically because this was the route of the Barlow Road in 1846. This was a bypass around Mount Hood, a shortcut on the Oregon Trail to avoid the dangerous rapids of the Columbia River. And parts of the hike follow this actual old wagon road. Another route through here was the Mount Hood Loop Highway built in 1923. This was kind of an extension of the historic Columbia River Gorge Highway that opened in 1916. They continued it all the way around Mount Hood and back to Portland. And your trailhead and much of the hike is on this old road. So you start there going up to Zigzag Falls. It's less than a half mile, easy hike for kids, good even with a stroller. The trailhead is actually shown in this picture here. This is from the construction of the Loop Highway in 1923. And the trailhead now is right in the middle of this picture at the bottom. You might notice that bridge abutment to the concrete abutment on the left, that is still there. But beyond that, the old highway is now a hiking trail. And after just less than half a mile, you get to a place where there's a tunnel underneath the highway. And this was built in the Depression by the Civilian Conservation Corps. They wanted to kind of reopen a portion of the Barlow Road for hikers and equestrians. And it doesn't follow the exact route of the Barlow Trail, but to do this, they had to make a tunnel under the highway that was tall enough for a person on horseback. And beyond this, if you do your loop up to Enid Lake, you do pass the shoulder of the noisy highway for a while. This whole route is really most popular with mountain bikers who zoom down from Government Camp. But you can mountain bike it or hike it either way. And when you get up to the top, you follow the old 1923 Loop Highway is really open just to not to car traffic anymore. And then you can do a loop that goes over to Enid Lake. Then you have a view of the top of Mount Hood, and it just makes a nice loop in this area with a bunch of historic interest. Part of it really on the Barlow Road, which was built by Sam Barlow. Turns out he was actually kind of a cantankerous, greedy old guy. He got the government to help him build most of that road and then charged a fee. So there's a number of places called toll gate in the area, and that's the fee he was charging passengers on that, people traveling that road, which today is now a more biker equestrian route. But wheels have always been important getting around Mount Hood. And that's true today too, because of the popular mountain bike trails that you can do, especially on the east side of Mount Hood, not actually in the wilderness. And one of the ones that I'd like to feature is a section that is also very nice to do as for hikers as well as mountain bikers. And it follows a little known Dog River Trail with a nice view of Mount Hood. And here, starting on the Highway 35 near Cooper Spur, this is between Government Camp and Hood River there. And it's about 3 miles up to a very good viewpoint, which would make a good turnaround point. But if you want it to continue, you can do the hiker-only zigzag trail and then have a shuttle come pick you back. So this whole area was stripped out by a flash flood in 1980, and they had to rebuild the highway and everything. This was another factor of the melting of the glaciers and the instability of Mount Hood. Trailhead, you pass a gate and then cross the Dog River, which is not very big. But what I like about this trail is that it starts in this wet, hemlock, lush rainforest, and then transitions to a drier ponderosa pine forest. And you get to see that shift from one to the other. And you also get some nice views of Mount Hood. And if you want to do the hike down the zigzag trail, that's hiker only and just crashes down zigzags by a rock slide down to the highway. But I thought a nice hike at Mount Hood that is not heavily used and often overlooked. Another hike on the east side of Mount Hood that I like is the Ball Point, and this takes you to the Badger Creek Wilderness, but a very dry eastern part of this where you transition from the dry, almost desert-like area up into the mountain forests. And you get some interesting rock formations along the way. This is a hike that I had featured in this book years ago, but there was a little fire and I just was kind of too lonely. And now lonely is good, so I'm wanting to feature this one again. The best access here is really through the Dalles and Duffer and the little ghost town of Friend. And then it's a mile up to a viewpoint saddle. You go around behind Ball Point through a little fire zone and a couple miles out to a viewpoint at this interesting rock formation. So the drive there is nice too. You really do go through the ghost town of Friend, which is marked by a silo and nothing else. And it's paved almost all of the way up to the trailhead, which you kind of have to watch for, partly because the sign is shot up, but also because it's facing the wrong way. Nice big parking area, so look for that. And then there's the trail. Now I'm doing this hike here in August, and it's really the wrong time to do it. You can see that if you do this in April or May, or even June, that it's just full of balsam root and other flowers. If you do wait until August, you'll still have the Mariposa lilies, and then the trail ducks behind Ball Point through an area that did burn, but is coming back with millions of Douglas fir seedlings. So it's green too. And then you transition into this drier forest of ponderosa pine, and rock formations start showing up. And you kind of have to look for a turnoff here. It's not very well marked, but I describe how to get to it. And you get to this helispot, which was where they had helicopters land for fire things, but it's now part of the wilderness, so it's really just a campsite. And from there, about a 200-foot trail leads out to these spectacular cliffs overlooking the whole Badger Creek Valley. And it's just a magical place that, again, you'll be the only person. It's very quiet, neat wildflowers. I like it because it is so quiet. And you know, it's one of the things we need to be looking for is trails where you can social distance and space out a little bit. And another one that would qualify for that and also has interesting rock formations is Table Rock. The Table Rock Wilderness is sort of east of Molalla, and this would be, south of Estacada, but it has a lot of the same lava formations as in the Silver Creek Falls area. And the popular hike up to the top of Table Rock is still there, and I'm not going to feature that today because I want to take you to a little known trail that takes you to a spectacular meadow also in the Table Rock Wilderness. And this is on a paved road, so you can drive there on pavement, but it's kind of a long paved road. And then you climb at a good grade up 2.5 miles to this meadow. You're unlikely to see anybody, and it's partly because the trailhead is a little bit hidden. And then you can come back on an old cat road, which you think, that shouldn't be nice, but it's actually gorgeous. And you have to walk back a little bit on a little known, on a rarely used dirt road. So here's our trailhead, and this is why this is so quiet. It's exactly where the pavement ends, and there is a trailhead sort of sign there that doesn't say what is there, and some boulders, but you see no trail. And you know, I kind of like this because not everybody's going to find this, but if you go through those bushes 20 feet, there is a real trail, and it's beautiful. It takes you up through the forest for 2.5 miles to a meadow, which is just full of flowers in June. And you'll see Oregon sunshine there, and just a Indian paintbrush and a whole variety of things. Beyond that, there's that you can make a loop by coming back on this cat road. Now, this was built before this was designated a wilderness area, and they just took a bulldozer and rammed it through the wilderness. And you'd think, what an ugly thing. But it has grown back now as one of the most beautiful trails that you can imagine, because it's just solid sour grass. This looks like shamrocks, these little three-leaved oxalis. They're edible. Don't eat too many. They have this tart lemon flavor, but they do have oxalic acid. So if you made a whole salad out of it, it'd probably give you an upset stomach. But lovely little walk back on that, and then a bit of a walk back on a gravel road back to your car. But you're really unlikely to see people on that trail, and it's not new exactly, but kind of forgotten. And that's really kind of what we need to do, especially with the virus and with overcrowding in general. Our goal really should be to go where other people don't go, to space out a bit. And that requires a little bit of creative work. And that's one of the reasons that I put a lot of effort into this new book, to come up with 100 alternatives for you that to places that are too crowded. Also had to redo the book because a lot of changes from fires and from just the crowding. For Dog Mountain, for example, in summer weekends, you should take a shuttle or get this permit. And you know, why do that? There are many other trails that don't have those problems. So elsewhere in the state, they're dealing with the crowding issue in different ways. In Jefferson Park here, and 19 trailheads near Bend and Three Sisters area, they are limiting the number of permits in a different way. And you have to buy advance permits online, and they're limited to the number of day hikers, to the number of parking spots that there actually are at the trailhead. So you're guaranteed a parking spot. And the number of overnight permits are limited to the number of actual campsites. So you're guaranteed an actual campsite. This, in a way, avoids the hassles of dealing with Angel's Rest, where there is no parking for you. You know, you're going to get there and find that it's completely full. Or Eagle Creek, where you want to go backpacking and every site is full and you're not allowed to camp elsewhere. You just have to turn around and go home. I don't like government coming in and telling you, you know, how many permits you can get and that you can't go places, but sometimes that is another way. And, you know, thinking the option is to just look for uncrowded places. I was thinking of using these symbols in my book. I did not. There still is some truth to this, though, that that a lot of the crowded trails are ones that have been recommended by social media, where crowds of people go to the top 3 or the top 1 trail, and they all on Facebook and Twitter show up at Dog Mountain Trailhead or Angel's Rest. And in my books, I cover 1,000 trails in Oregon in my 5 guidebooks for the state. And for the Portland area, I not only have the 100 featured ones, but 99 more at the back of the book. I've added 16 pages back there. And these are often really quiet trails, often just as spectacular as the ones that the crowds go to using Facebook or Twitter or one of these social media things. And you know, that really needs to be our goal, is to spread out a bit. And we've got room. I mean, look at what we have in Oregon. Where else on the planet can you go from a coastline this beautiful, the whole coast's open to the public, and on one tank of gas go to mountains with glaciers and wind up in what looks like the Sahara Desert, but is the John Day fossil beds of Eastern Oregon? That kind of diversity gives us a lot of options, but I think it also gives us a responsibility to know our state and to spread out a little bit and protect it. It's important now, particularly because we need to not damage these areas, but also not damage each other. I think getting apart and getting some room to hike is important. You know, I was raised to believe that you should leave a campsite in as good shape as you found it. I think that is also true of a state. And in Oregon, that's difficult because so many people are moving here, often because of the recreation. And to protect that, we need to know our state, spread out, and look for new places to hike. And that's one reason that I'm giving this presentation here for the library, and hoping that you'll go out and explore some new hikes in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington. Well, even if you can't get to a bookstore, and you can always get these books at the library if they're open, and you can also download them at from OregonHiking.com, my website, and because they're available on Kindle and ebook as well.
That was great, Bill. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your new book with us, and we look forward to getting back out on the trails.